She said it was boundaries. I heard the word goodbye, the door shut, and I realized my name had been moved on a list. The phrase arrived like a polite note slid under a door. It was soft, the kind of speech you expect in a kitchen, but it landed like a lock. I remember the cup on the counter half full and waiting. The suitcase by the door sat quiet, a small thing that suddenly had too much meaning. The porch light hummed as evening moved in. The doorframe felt narrower somehow, as if my place in the house had shifted without warning. People use the word boundaries like a promise. They say it kindly and expect gratitude, but sometimes it is a rebuke wrapped in neighborly language. That night, the words changed the shape of our home. I stood in the hallway with my hand on the doorknob and felt the strange smallness of an ordinary life rearranged. You will want to know how a single polite phrase became a turning point. Stay with me as I tell what followed. The door shut and I realized my name had been moved on a list. This is a story about keeping your dignity and about deciding when to say yes and when to leave. Today we're talking about kindness, limits, and when a polite word becomes a door. Stay with me. I'll tell you how a boundary turned into a goodbye. Hello, my dear. Come sit at my kitchen table. Today we're talking about kindness, limits, and when a polite word becomes a door. I want to tell this story plainly, because small truths help other people find courage. If you like these conversations, please subscribe and leave a comment. Your words make this space feel fuller. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that asking for clarity is not rude. I will tell you what I learned the hard way: how to say no without being mean, when to write things down, and why a witness can keep promises honest. There will be moments that sting, and moments of gentle repair. Stay with me, I'll tell you how a boundary turned into a goodbye. At the end, I'll share simple steps you can use, small scripts that helped me keep my home and my heart. Thank you. The kettle sighed and I kept the porch light on. Like always on the mantel, a post-it with a new name made my chest tightened. Morning started the same way it had for years. The lace curtain caught the light just right, the kind of light that shows the dust and forgives it anyway. I set the cup down on the table with its small dent, a little hollow worn by elbows and time. The radio murmured the weather clear, with a chance of change. It made me smile because that's how most of life works. Clear, until it isn't. I stirred my tea and watched the steam rise like a signal. My spoon clinked against the china, steady, rhythmic, like keeping time with an old friend. The house smelled faintly of toast, of lemon polish, of the lavender I keep by the window. These are small things, but they hold me together. Outside, a sparrow hopped along the porch rail. The porch light hummed, though the sun was already up. I keep it on, out of habit and hope. You never know who might come home late. The spare chair at the table sits across from me. It has its own presence, almost like a witness. I keep it clean. Sometimes I set another cup there, just in case. Not for a ghost, but for a memory, for conversation that might find its way back. My morning rituals used to feel like grounding. Now they feel like proof. Proof that I am still here. Proof that a quiet woman can keep her routines, even when life edits her out of the bigger plans. The answering machine blinked twice. I didn't rush to check it. Most days it's a robocall or a reminder about something that doesn't matter. But that little red light feels alive in a room that's too still. I took a sip, felt the tea coat my throat, and listened to the pipes groan their familiar complaint. Old house, old bones, old heart. We make our peace with creaks. The newspaper came late. I left it on the porch. I like the sound of it, landing soft, certain. I like knowing someone still knows where I live. On the shelf sits a photograph. My husband leaning on a fence post, laughing like he'd just thought of something clever. Every morning, I nod to him. Morning, love, I whisper. He's been gone 12 years, but it still feels rude not to speak. The radio voice changed to a song from the 70s, and I let it fill the kitchen while I wiped the counter. The tea cooled, the lights stretched long. Time in an old house doesn't move in minutes. It moves in rituals. You'd think calm like that would last, but peace has edges, and lately, I've been feeling them. A few weeks back, my daughter-in-law stopped by. She said she'd been thinking about making space. Her voice was soft, careful, like someone tiptoeing across a frozen pond. I smiled and nodded, not knowing I was standing on that same ice. She said they'd been learning about boundaries in a podcast, her word, not mine, and how they were trying new patterns. I didn't think much of it at first. Families talk about space. We all need air, but air, when it's too much, becomes distance. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked from room to room, touching things that were still mine. The quilt on the chair, the chipped vase by the window, the radio's static hum. Each one whispered, "You belong here." But a whisper can sound a lot like a warning dot in the dark. I heard the refrigerator click on and off, a heartbeat in the quiet. I sat back down at the table, waiting for morning, waiting for something to feel solid again. By dawn, the kettle was already on. I moved through my routine slowly, as if to remind myself that ownership begins in habit. The sunlight hit the floorboards, tracing the grooves my husband had sanded by hand. I could still see where our son had dragged his chair as a boy. Little scars of family life, beautiful ones, honest ones. But that morning, when I reached for the sugar jar, something was missing. Not the sugar, something else. That feeling of belonging without question. Sometimes loss doesn't announce itself. It just slips in, rearranges the furniture of your mind, and sits down like it's always lived there. The clock ticked. The radio hummed. My tea cooled, and then I saw, it's small, yellow, barely there, a post-it note on the mantel, written in my daughter-in-law's careful handwriting. It said, "Please update contact for deliveries under Melissa Hart now." A small note, a practical thing, but to me, it was a flag in familiar soil, a sign that something that once had my name had been reassigned. On the mantel, that little post-it glowed in the morning light, and just like that my chest tightened, because that's how it starts, with a name on paper, and the quiet question of who belongs where. My mother lit the porch light for anyone who came home late. I taught my son to stand by his word, but time and tides shift things. I grew up in a town where people borrowed sugar and returned the bowl with cookies, where the word neighbor meant something close to family. My father believed in tools and truth. He fixed fences, patched roofs, and never broke a promise. He'd say, "If your word isn't good, your hands can't fix a thing." I didn't understand that as a girl, but now it feels carved into me. My mother ran her house like a quiet ministry. She never left a guest hungry, and she always asked after their heart before she asked about their work. Her rule was simple: when you open your door, mean it. That's what I learned to do, open my door and mean it. When I was 17, I met my husband Arthur at a church picnic. He had a laugh that sounded like summer, easy, unguarded, a little reckless. He asked if he could carry my mother's pie to the table. I said yes, though she didn't need the help. Sometimes kindness is just a way of starting a story. Arthur was steady. He worked with his hands, spoke with his eyes, and thought before he promised. We built our life in small increments: one fence, one room, one shared look across a crowded supper table. When we married, he told me, "I'll build us a house where the light never burns out." P did, a modest one, with creaky floors and wide windows, the kind of home that breathes. Our son was born 3 winters later. I held him and thought, here's the reason the porch light stays on. I taught him early. You look people in the eye. You answer when called. You say sorry first when you're wrong. And for a long time, he did. Life back then was simple, but not easy. We didn't have much money, so we traded in favors and faith. My husband worked long days, and I learned how to stretch a dollar until it looked proud. I made casseroles for neighbors, watched other people's kids, baked extra loaves just in case someone came by unannounced. I believed that giving without tallying kept a family's soul healthy. When my husband passed, I kept the same ways. It was how I remembered him. I believed that keeping old habits kept us close, that if the porch light stayed on, maybe he could still find his way home in the dark. But love and loyalty can teach you habits that the modern world calls outdated. People today talk about energy and boundaries and self-care. We used to call it manners, patience, and grace. Sometimes I wonder if we renamed things to make distance sound polite. When my son married, I tried to be gentle with the changing times. My daughter-in-law was polite, well-read, organized. She spoke in lists. She talked about therapy and scheduling and emotional bandwidth. At first, I admired her smart and careful, but sometimes careful can mean calculated. She brought charts into family life, and my son started repeating her phrases. "Mom, we're setting new boundaries," he'd say. Or, "We need to prioritize our nuclear unit." The first time I heard that, I thought he meant power plant. But I tried to learn. I didn't want to be the bitter mother. I wanted to be the bridge. Still, I missed the old rhythm, the kind where love didn't need a checklist. If you've lived long enough, you know love doesn't disappear all at once. It thins, it frays around the edges. I watched my son's visits shorten, his calls grow fewer, his excuses grow longer. Each absence came with a resent: new job, long commute, tired child. But reasons don't fill silence. And yet, I never stopped setting the table for 3, because my mother lit the porch light for anyone who came home late, and I still believed that meant something. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that the world had changed its words, and I was still living by the old ones. I taught my son to stand by his word, but time and tides shift things. We trusted habit to hold us steady until it didn't. Tone replaced key on the little dish told me everything had shifted, Arthur, and I built our life with a rhythm that didn't need reminding. We had work, we had supper, we had Sunday church. We spoke through looks and laughter, not schedules. Our son grew up knowing that love was measured in presence, not promises. He'd sit by the porch steps, his knees scraped, his hair wild, and Arthur would say, "If you're here, you're home." After Arthur died, I filled the space with small routines. I tended the garden, kept the books, called my son every Sunday at 4. For a while, the rhythm held, but life is a quiet negotiator, asks for small adjustments until you don't recognize the deal you've made. It started with favors, a load of laundry here, babysitting there. I didn't mind. Helping is a muscle that only feels right when it's used. But over time, help became expectation. I would call to say hello, and she'd answer with a task. "Could you pick up diapers?" Or, "Can you stay while I run errands?" I said yes, because that's what mothers do. But yes has a way of erasing you if you say it too often. The fault line was gentle at first, a hairline crack you could step over. Then came the small silences, the missed invitations, the shifting of plans without asking me. They called it progress. I called it polite distance. Still, I held my ground. I brought casseroles. I smiled in photos. I stayed kind, because kindness is what keeps the earth spinning. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing how easily kindness can be mistaken for consent. Then one Sunday, I arrived at their house, and the locks had been changed. Not maliciously, not even intentionally, they said. It was for security. They gave me a new key with a smile. But when I set it down on the little dish beside my own, something inside me ached. The keys didn't match. One was mine, one was permission. I looked at the dish and thought, this is how it starts, ownership turning into allowance. One replaced key on the little dish told me everything had shifted. She asked me to stay just until things settled. The spare room closed, and the calendar filled with other people's needs. It was an easy sentence, soft as a hand on a shoulder. She said it in that careful tone people use when they don't want to make a scene. "Mom," she said, "we could use some help for a little while." The little while sounded like one of those polite lies families tell one another to keep the air smooth. I packed a small bag anyway. It felt right. I packed my slippers and a sweater and a casserole. I thought, I'll be useful. I'll come, do what's needed, and go home. The first week was exactly that, helpful and ordinary. I learned where they kept the bandages. I found the good mugs. I made soup and stayed up in the night when the baby fussed. I folded laundry and put stickers on a school folder that had been torn. I liked being useful. It made me feel needed in a way that warmed my chest. Then the second week arrived with an extra request. Could I stay another week just in case? I said yes. My son's voice was tired on the phone. My daughter-in-law's gratitude was soft and fierce all at once. "We're so lucky you're here," she said. I wanted to be. Love sometimes asks for you to bend, and I had bent for a lifetime. Weeks became a ledger in my head. 1, 2, 3. Each one more week felt smaller than the last. I told myself they were overwhelmed. I told myself I'd make a plan to return. But life has ways of rearranging itself around your kindness. Your calendar fills not with your plans but with other people's needs. Small things began to change. My mail sat unsorted. My appointments got postponed. My dentist's reminder sat with the paperbacks on my nightstand. I'd tell myself, tomorrow, I'll go back. Tomorrow always felt plausible, until it became habitual. I noticed myself losing the edges of decisions. My son made calls I used to make. He scheduled repairs. He answered neighbors. It was practical, I told myself. They were handling things, and yet, practical can also mean permission to decide for someone. There were moments of tenderness. They were tired and grateful and a little lost. I understood that compassion can be the reason we let things slide. But compassion without conversation becomes assumption. Someone decides for you in the name of mercy, and mercy begins to look like removal. I tried to keep my routines, my tea at 7, my list on the fridge, but the lists grew longer with other people's names. I would wake at night and count obligations like rosary beads. pick up groceries, take in laundry, water that plant by the window. My body learned a double rhythm, one for my own life and one for the household I was temporarily living in. Neighbors nodded and said I was kind. "You're being a good mother," they said, as if that explained all the empty squares on my calendar. Gratitude looks generous from a distance. Up close, it can be a small eraser rubbing you out. I began to notice how decisions that should have included me simply happened. A contractor came by and fixed a gutter without asking whether I was comfortable with strangers in my home. Boxes were moved into storage and labeled in handwriting not my own. The spare room that had been mine for an evening was arranged into a workspace for their life desk, lamp, charging cords. The spare room closed and the calendar filled with other people's needs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how quietly it happened, by increments, by favor, by 1,000 little yeses. And then the joke of just until things settled felt less like a promise and more like a plan made without me. Requests looked like gratitude, then like orders. A neighbor came with a casserole and the words, "Are you staying long?" At first, they asked for small things. Could I pick up milk? Could I stay one morning while she worked? The tone was always polite. It would really help, she would say. I believed them because that is what mothers do. A favor is a circle you close, but favors can also be the bricks of a new foundation you did not consent to build. Days filled with errands that were not just theirs or mine. I'd stop at the pharmacy for a prescription for someone I barely knew. I'd drive to a neighbor's because a child needed a ride. I counted 2 ovens worth of casseroles as my own. My life, the one I had carved out for decades, began to accumulate other people's debts. One morning, I missed an appointment because I was at the pediatrician's waiting room, clutching a magazine about retirement. You don't pick at the choice when someone needs you, but the choices pile up until you are no longer the chooser. My doctor called, polite, and I explained. "Oh, it's fine," he said. "We'll reschedule." The rescheduling became a habit of loss. A missed appointment is a small thing. A missed life is a pattern. Neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Dalton came by with a casserole and eyes like a woman figuring out a math problem with too many variables. "Are you staying long?" she asked, stirring the spoon against the dish. Her voice had the curious edge of someone balancing concern and curiosity. The question landed differently than intended. I smiled and made small talk, but the meaning bent in my chest. People assume reasons, they whisper solutions. You hear, "Why don't you move closer?" Or maybe it's time to downsize. It feels like everyone is offering efficiency at the cost of your history. They mean well, most of them, but well-meaning can be a tide that carries you away if you're not anchored. Household items began to circulate. My knitted shawl that I use in the evenings was borrowed more than once and returned with faint smells not my own. Small comforts are also identity markers. When they start to travel without explanation, you feel a little less like you belong in the room. I started to write things down again, lists of med appointments, the number for my plumber, the dates I would need for my own small life. I tacked them on the fridge with a magnet. It felt like leaving breadcrumbs for myself, as if I might follow them back home. There were points when my patience ran thin. I would speak up, politely. "Please ask before you move something," I'd say. The reply was gratitude mixed with surprise. "We thought it would be easier this way." They would say, "Easier for whom?" I began to find myself standing on the edges of conversations I used to belong to. My voice became smaller, but I kept helping. I kept the dinners, the school pickups, the appointments, because a mother's yes is a kind of prayer. "I am here. I will hold you." Yet there is a difference between holding and being held captive by good intentions. Small hands can be gentle and still hold you in place. A casserole on the porch, a neighbor's sideways question, these are the little things that make big stories. They plant seeds in the soil of a life and then watch what grows. A neighbor came with a casserole and the words, "Are you staying long?" My calendar emptied where his promise should have been, while I was folding laundry at their house. I forgot my own mail on the kitchen counter back home. A few days later, I found a stack of unopened envelopes in a box at their place, bills, postcards, a small notice from the county. It felt like finding my life tucked into a shoebox. I wondered how long it had been there, how many times my name had been left unread. There were calls about overdue notices and repair reminders. I called, my voice a little brittle, and set the accounts straight. You can fix a bill with a conversation, but you can't easily fix the sense that your life was being scheduled by other people. I felt that indignity in my bones. Once, I missed a dentist appointment because I had agreed to watch a child for an extra evening. The dentist understood. "We'll get you in next month," he said. But all those little reschedulings stack into a life. Half-lived appointments become suggestions rather than rights. The mailbox, once a place where my name lived with authority, began to hold only junk and reminders. One afternoon, I went back to their house to pick up a sweater I'd left. I opened a closet and saw a box labeled "Donate." In it was my favorite teacup, the blue one with the hairline crack from years ago that I always used for my first morning cup. I had used it since Arthur left. It held memories in its thin porcelain. My throat tightened, seeing it among someone else's decisions about what to keep and what to let go. I pulled it out. Its glaze cold under my fingers. The label on the box wasn't meant to hurt. It was practical. But kindness logic can be callous when it doesn't ask permission. Someone else had decided which objects in my life were surplus. Someone else had decided I was ready to be edited. That teacup in the donate box felt like a small proof of erasure. I sat with it for a long while, thinking about how easy it is to reassign things when the person to whom they belong is too polite or too tired to protest. I carried it home and placed it on the mantel, where it looked a little bruised but intact. Word spreads fast in little towns. I heard a few murmurs, concerned advice, the kind of sympathy that comes with a recipe card and a kiss on the cheek. Some suggested I accept the change and be grateful for family who wanted efficiency. Others said I should stand firm. Advice is heavy when you're fragile. The emotional cost of help is often invisible. It's the quiet shrinking of a life. You wake one morning and realize your choices have become other people's defaults. You notice your name on no lists, your cup in no customary spot. I found myself bargaining. What could I do to be useful without being invisible? What goodwill could I give that would not take my roof with it? But even with all the practical noise, the loneliness has a clear shape. It's not dramatic. It's small. It smarts. You hold the broken cup and wonder which part of you will be boxed next. I keep that teacup on the mantel now, as a small claim and a reminder. I found my teacup in a box labeled "Donate," and I kept it. I wanted to shake him and ask, "Are you all right?" There were signs, not the kind you notice at first, but the kind that pile up like small stones. He started looking tired in a way tea can't fix. He had lines around his mouth he didn't have before. He was quieter at dinner. Once, at the grocery store, he turned his face toward his phone like it was a shield. Sometimes life doesn't announce sorrow. It hides it under work and new routines. I could see the weariness, if not the exact cause. Neighbors told me bits and pieces in the way. People do slow and under breath. A night shift, a late call, a new obligation. He was carrying something, they said. I could tell. There were times I wanted to knock on his truck window and say, "Tell me." It felt intrusive and necessary at once. Then, one afternoon, I saw him across town. He was standing by the bakery, hands in pockets, a man's shoulders set to weather something I didn't know. I wanted to cross the street. I wanted to wrap my arms around him and say, "You don't have to hold it alone." I didn't. Instead, I waited to see if he would look up, or if he would even notice me. He glanced in my direction, then turned away. He passed by without knocking and kept going. The ache that opened inside me was not only that he walked by, it was that he had chosen distance as his armor. Sometimes people step back because they are ashamed of what they carry. Shame is a sneaky thing. It tells you that asking for help is weakness when really, it is the first word of repair. I tried other routes. I left notes on his windshield sometimes, little things, phones in the kitchen, or left spare key. I called and left messages that sounded too bright, trying not to push. There were a handful of replies short, clipped, "Busy, call later." Okay? Those small words can be scaffolding, or they can be salt. Friends told me to be patient. "He's young, he'll figure it out," they'd say. Others said, "Confront him, ask plainly." The advice tugged me different ways. I was tired of being wise, and tired of being wrong. One evening, when the air smelled like rain, I stood on my porch and watched his truck pass. I thought of all the promises I had given him, the way I taught him to say, "I'm sorry," the way I held him on nights he skinned his knees. I thought about how those lessons sometimes get lost under the weight of a life that expects you to be both parent and invisible manager. I knocked on his door that night, and he opened it just enough to see me. I wanted to say, "What's wrong?" I wanted to ask if he needed help, but what came out was small and careful. "Can we talk?" He looked away. "Not now," he said, and shut the door gently, as if the conversation might catch and burn the house down. I stood on the walkway with my hand on the doorknob, feeling the cool air pry open the space between us. He passed by without knocking, and I bit open a quiet ache. They said there wasn't time, and time is everything. Practicality has a way of pressing you like a hand on the back of your neck. The months of small absences had led to a thing that has to be fixed: a sagging roof, an insurance renewal, a note from the city about property trimming. The contractor's estimate was honest. The insurance company's deadline was not. "There's a window," the realtor said, over the phone, her voice brisk with a market's cadence. "If you list now, you'll catch the price. If you wait, you risk storm season." Time, suddenly, had an edge. My son and his wife folded those realities into one practical sentence. It would be simpler if we consolidated. Simpler what? A useful word. It carries the weight of everyone's convenience, not the weight of memories. It sounds neat. It feels tidy. It also risks making a history into an inventory. I asked for a little time to think. I wanted counsel. I wanted to sit and remember what the house meant, not only the numbers it carried. You don't understand how much a house holds until someone asks you to move it. The house keeps seams of your life: the spot where Arthur whittled, the dent where a kid's favorite toy used to bounce, the ledge where my mother left bread to cool. All these small things matter. They are not line items. They put a timeline on the table, and it looked like an ultimatum. 2 weeks to decide, an offer that would be reviewed if I didn't respond. People who have never had to choose fast pretend speed is mercy. But speed can be a lever used to make your consent look like cooperation, that there were good reasons on the other side. My son was tired. His shoulders had been leaning toward their own house for years. He needed a solution that removed the extra. "We need to plan a future for our children," he said, with the practicality of someone trying to be a responsible adult. I understood that. I wanted to be helpful. I also wanted my choices to be mine, not the byproduct of someone else's timetable. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, and asked her advice. She told me to take my time and also to ask a question. "Who pays what?" She said. "Money tends to make ghosts of good intentions." That small wisdom settled like a cool hand across my worry. So I did something new. I asked for writing. I asked for a plan printed out, shared costs, a timeline, and the right to a 30-day notice before any sale. I asked for a 3-month reassessment and a mediator at the table if things got heated. It felt like modest armor. They looked surprised. Not evil, just used to moving fast. "You don't trust us," my son said, voice low. The line between trust and structure is thin. I told him I trusted him enough to ask for a schedule. He sighed, as if I had asked him to sign away a secret. "We need to move quickly," his wife said. "We can't wait while the market changes." Her eyes pleaded for simplicity and speed. Pressure sharpens faces. When people are worn, they want simpler paths, even if they cut deeper memories. I could see fear and fatigue in them, but I could also see how easy it would be for my life to be folded into a choice that suited their calendar. They asked me to decide before the week was out, and that's when I knew I needed more than patience. I needed shape. They were carrying burdens I hadn't seen. Miss Dalton came over one afternoon with a thermos of coffee and a look I have learned to read. It is the same look people give when they carry news that sits between apology and mercy. She sat at my table, slow and steady, and said, "Evelyn, I don't want to pry, but I think you should know." I set my cup down a little harder than I meant to. Her words felt like a hand turning a page. She told me what I had not seen. My son had been laid off months ago. The factory let half the crew go after a fall in orders. He took on temporary work, drop shipping nights, driving anything that would pay the rent. The hours were brutal. The checks were small. The pride that once made him refuse handouts had become a quiet hunger that kept him silent. Then she added another thing. Softer this time. The daughter-in-law's mother had gotten sick, a slow illness that drained time and savings, hospital bills and medicine, and the endless appointments. My daughter-in-law had been juggling 2 jobs and late-night care. They were both walking on thin boards and balancing everything else on their shoulders. No one had planned a crash. Life had simply piled weight onto them. They were carrying burdens I hadn't seen. The revelation made my anger fold inward. It is a strange thing when the person who hurts you is also worn raw by other hurts. Compassion arrived like rain on a dusty street. You want to water the roots, not punish the leaves. I felt that compassion tug at my sternness. How could I be merely angry when I saw the weight they bore? But seeing does not erase the ache of being moved aside. It simply complicates it. I felt both softened and more resolute. I understood why decisions had been rushed and why voices had sounded clipped. I also remembered that desperation can make people do the wrong kind of work for the right reasons. They had chosen speed over conversation. They had mistaken urgency for clarity. That afternoon, I walked the block slowly and thought like a woman who has lived long enough to know that charity without structure becomes chaos. I remembered my father's rule: fix what breaks, but keep the bolts in place. Compassion without boundaries can let you become invisible by degrees. So I made a new plan in my head, one that kept mercy and made space for dignity. I would help very deliberately. I would not vanish. I would ask for small agreements on paper. I would ask for times and receipts and a reassessment date. It felt like asking for permission to be loved in a way that did not erase me. That plan came with cost. It would bruise tender feelings. It might be read as stubbornness. It might look like ingratitude. I knew this because the town had eyes and opinions about how families should behave when tides rose. But I also knew that to keep my house of self intact, I had to set beams where needed. I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote the list. Help with childcare 2 days a week for 3 months. Shared contributions to repairs. Regular communication. No more weeks of silence, and a mediator, if we could not come to agreements. I underlined the reassessment date twice. Writing felt like the first real breath after a held one. Mrs. Dalton put her hand on mine and said, "You're right to ask for structure. Love is kind, but it is not a cage." Her voice steadied me. I folded my list and placed it in my bag. This would be the shape of the conversation I would call for. I felt less alone. That night, I sat by the window and watched a car pass with a radio humming. I thought about the ways people survive and the ways they forget. Knowing what they carried did not make forgiving automatic. It made the question harder: how to give without being given away. Knowing didn't make forgiving automatic. I would help, but on terms that kept me whole. Saying it felt like learning a new language at 6. I had spent most of my life saying yes because yes is how you keep people warm. Now I had to say yes with footnotes. I wrote the requests plainly. A 3-month a shared repair fund with monthly contributions, weekly short calls, and a longer Sunday conversations. Something simple and regular. A fridge calendar with initials so small promises wouldn't slide into forgetting. I asked that they not sell the house or move my things without asking. I asked for mail to be forwarded to my address when I was away. Practical things, not dramatic. Things that make a life manageable. When I laid the paper down, I watched their faces. My son's jaw tightened like a man remembering he was tired. My daughter-in-law folded her hands and looked like a woman juggling everything and fearing the dish she held might break. They were anxious. They were also relieved, I think, to finally have a plan that took some weight off without erasing anyone. But the first response was not gratitude. "You don't trust us," my son said. It came out sharp, like a blade that had been used too often. I told him I trusted him enough to ask for clarity. Trust, I said, is not the opposite of structure. Sometimes it's the house that holds trust up. The mediator from church agreed to sit with us. She came with a quiet voice and a notepad. She taught us how to speak and how to listen one person at a time. No interruptions, 1 minute per response, no long tangents. It kept the conversation honest and small. After the meeting, there was friction. Someone always reads boundaries as accusations. My son called me later, voice raw. "You make this hard," he said. "You always find a reason to make things difficult." It wasn't anger so much as fatigue, but it landed like a stone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst was feeling accused for asking to stay, for being told that my need to be seen was stubbornness. Sometimes, dignity asks you to accept discomfort from those you love. You accept it because the alternative is silence. I slept badly that night, thinking of our conversation replaying in his tired tones. The next morning, friends called. "Are you sure?" one asked, cautious. Another said, "Be gentle." Even kindness comes with counsel that can sound like pressure. The cost of my plan became visible in small social votes, some for me, some against. It wound into the fabric of daily life. I received casseroles and side glances in equal measure, yet I held to the paper. I'd rather be called stubborn than unmoored. There is a dignity in asking for simple things: notice given back, and time set aside for negotiation. Those small artifacts, receipts, dates, initials on a calendar row, the scaffolding of respect. They called my insistence stubbornness that night. The town's voices felt like weather, some kind, some cold. Word moves fast in a small place. By the 3rd day after our meeting, People at the post office had opinions, everyone had advice. Some came bearing others offered thin smiles and practical lectures. It is odd how neighbors can be comfort and jury in the same breath. At church, a woman touched my arm and said, "You know, generosity is its own grace." I smiled, not wanting to argue. Grace is a large word and I did not want to make it feel small. But sometimes grace needs guardrails, otherwise it becomes permission to take. Another neighbor, when she thought I couldn't hear, asked if I'd considered how much easier life would be if I downsized. The suggestion felt like a nudge toward a cliff. My son texted less. His messages came in short burst schedules, confirmations, updates about repairs. The daughter-in-law's tone over email grew brisk and efficient, as though life were a spreadsheet to be balanced. Practicality is persuasive when people are tired. When you are caretaking, efficiency can feel like survival. I understood that. I also understood that survival can be made at someone else's expense if no one checks the balance sheet. There were small acts of kindness, though. Mrs. Dalton mowed my lawn one afternoon and refused to take payment. A woman from church drove me to a doctor's appointment. These quiet services were like stitches in a cloth that was fraying. They reminded me that while some voices edified my anxiety, others repaired it. The mediator called to confirm the family meeting. "We'll keep things calm," she said. "Bring notes, bring a witness if you'd like." I put the reminder on my fridge, in bright ink. The practical action of penciling a time felt less like a trap and more like a map. That evening, I made tea strong enough to keep us talking. I set the table, not for confrontation but for conversation, because I believe food makes even hard words softer. I arranged the chairs as if to offer everyone an equal place. The act of arranging the room felt like an offering. I wanted the meeting to be civil, human, possible. The town's weather kept shifting outside my windows. Sun, then clouds, polite faces, then folded looks. I walked the garden and talked aloud to the lavender my husband planted. "Keep me steady," I told it. Talking to plants is a small therapy. It is also honest. Plants do not judge when you ask for steadiness. Tomorrow the whole family would sit at my kitchen table. I slept badly that night, but I slept with purpose. There is a calm that comes when you commit to an action and accept its messy consequences. The world may judge you for the way you stand, but standing is its own work. I wanted to stand with grace. There were nights I felt unmoored and very old. The house grew large in the dark. The familiar hum of the porch light sounded, but it was a low, thin thing. I lay awake and listened to my own breath. It is strange how loud your body can be when everything else goes quiet. I thought of leaving. I packed once, not for drama, just to see what it would feel like to fold my life into a suitcase and walk down the street. I put a toothbrush in a little case, a sweater, a photograph of Arthur wrapped in tissue, and a pair of my good slippers. It felt both like surrender and a test. Would I be brave enough to go? Would leaving be relief or regret? Memories came like small lamps. Arthur's hands, calloused and sure, smoothing out a tablecloth. His laugh when the dog stole his sandwich. The way he left notes in the kitchen. "Don't forget the tomatoes." Those little things had the weight of foundation stones now. They reminded me what had been built, not for boasting but as a map of belonging. I made a list of what I would not trade. The house with its dented table, the quilt on my chair, the key on the little dish, my weekly call with Mrs. Dalton, the garden. These were not grand things. They were the architecture of my life. I wrote them down in a thick ink and pinned the list to my bulletin board. It felt like drawing a line in sand. But lines matter. I also wrote what I could offer. A few evenings of babysitting, meals twice a week, modest help with bills if needed and agreed upon, but only for a set time. I wanted to be generous, not erased. I wanted to help without being consumed. That decision felt like learning to cook with fire. Youthful, but you must always watch the flame. My hands shook a little as I closed the suitcase. I thought of taking it to Mrs. Dalton's guest room, but as I stood with the bag and the night breathing around me, I walked to the window. Outside, the maple that Arthur planted moved in the wind. The house that we made together had 1,000 small memories tucked into its walls. I could leave and take some things, but the rest would be there, my life folded in shelves and drawers. Could I leave that without leaving myself? I imagined the neighbors' voices the next morning. "She left," they'd say, and somewhere in it would be a question of pride and pity. I did not want to be written off as the woman who ran. Courage is not always running away. Sometimes it is staying in a house and asking for fair terms. I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened the suitcase again. I took out the photograph of Arthur and smoothed the edges. I tucked the sweater back into the basket. I wrote one more thing on my list. Ask for a mediator. Ask for paper. Keep your key. I folded the paper into my wallet like a talisman. The kettle clicked on in the kitchen. Its small, faithful song. I poured myself tea and let the warmth keep my hands steady. I whispered to the photograph, "We stay. Not forever. Not without terms, but we stay with the right to be seen." I almost left with one small bag that night. I chose respect for myself rather than shrinking to fit. It felt like a new posture, less about anger and more about steadiness. I called the mediator and set a date. I asked Mrs. Dalton to be my witness and friend. I printed my list, neat and unadorned. Shared expenses, 3-month help, weekly calls, and a no-sale clause without 30 days' notice. On the day, the house smelled like lemon and yeast. I made tea and set out cups. The mediator arrived with her quiet notebook. My son came in, hair too long at the collar, looking tired. His wife followed. We sat, and the mediator reminded us of the rules. One person speaks at a time. We listen, we note, no interruptions. I started simply. "I love you," I said. "I will help. I will not vanish. Here is what that help looks like." I read the items slowly, letting the words sit between us. When I finished, I closed the paper and waited. My son's face changed. He tried to be reasonable. He tried to explain the pressure, the bills, the fear. He said things like, "It's complicated and we're exhausted." I listened. I did not interrupt. I could hear in his voice the small man I'd once fussed over at night when he had nightmares. But then, after a pause, his voice broke. "You're making this worse," he said. "You're making our lives harder." It was frustration wrapped in hurt. He sounded like a man squeezed from all sides. The words hit me. They cut because they came from someone I'd known since he was small enough to sit on my lap. I kept my voice steady. "I am offering help with terms," I said. "I'm asking for clarity because that keeps dignity." They looked at me with a mixture of surprise and something like relief. The world's slipperiness made plain. We laid out the plan on the table and signed a simple agreement. It was not legalese. It was practical. Shared costs, a clear timeline, a calendar on the fridge. The mediator wrote it down and made copies. It felt like setting posts in the ground. Afterward, my son called that night. His voice on the phone was raw. "You don't understand how much we're juggling," he said. "Why can't you just be easier?" He used sharp words, tired words. It hurt. It was a cost I had not wanted but had expected. Setting boundaries often brings back fire before it brings warmth. I hung up and sat with the hurt. I breathed. I poured tea. I reminded myself that being asked to be easier is sometimes a plea dressed as an accusation. I told myself I had done the brave thing, asked for fairness, and made room for help. I had not chosen I had chosen terms. He called me that night and used words that cut. I said simply, "I did not come to be erased." Saying it out loud felt like placing a lantern on the table. It made shadows step back. The kitchen smelled like lemon and old tea. My hands were steady because I had practiced steadiness for a long time. The mediator sat with her notebook. My son's jaw was a hard line. My daughter-in-law's fingers twisted in her lap. We began not with blame but with small facts. I told them about the post-it on the mantel. I told them about the teacup found in a donate box. I told them about missed calls and postponed doctor's visits. I did not make the list for drama. I made it because a paper trail is a kind of truth. They listened. They did not look away. They answered beside the things they could not change. He told us about the nights driving routes for extra money. He told about the interview that had not gone well. She told us about the hospital corridors and the sharp hush of waiting rooms. They said the word stress and then sorry, as if the two belonged together. Apologies fell in pieces. Some were plain, some were clumsy, but they were spoken. Then the conversation shifted to the practical, because grief and need are often very tidy when listed. The mediator wrote down the items: a repair fund with regular contributions, a calendar on the fridge where initials would mark small responsibilities, weekly check-ins of 10 minutes each Sunday, and a 3-month reassessment to see how things were going. We discussed forwarding mail and asking before moving someone's things. These were simple things, surprising in their ability to heal. I asked one more small thing. If important decisions about my house were to be made, we would all sign off, not because I did not trust them, but because trust is not a substitute for talk. My son looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in a long while. "We'll do it," he said. His voice wavered. The pledge sounded real because now paper held it and hands had to show work. For a long time, I said softly. I felt like a photograph in the hallway, something pretty to glance at, but not to move or to ask about. My son reached across the table then, slow, and took my hand. It was not a grand gesture. It did not erase the months. Yet it was something. It said, I am here, even if late. There were moments of friction. He said things that hurt. You always make things harder than they need to be, he said, between breaths. Those words stung because they came from long familiarity. I swallowed the hurt and answered. I asked for clarity, not punishment. Language matters. Choosing words that name rather than wound is repair work. The mediator proposed we schedule the first repair, and that the fund be set up within 2 weeks. We named names for who would call the contractor and who would watch the children while the work was done. She suggested we put small, enforceable steps on paper, little acts that equaled trust. We did. It felt like making stew, a few ingredients simmering together until the flavor returns. When the meeting wound down, practicalities were in place. There were handshakes and a few quiet apologies. The daughter-in-law wiped her eyes and said she had been wrong to let fear run decisions. My son promised to be more present in name and deed. Agreements were signed, photocopied, and pinned to the fridge. It felt tidy in a way that felt earned. Then my son did something I did not expect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a scribbled list of jobs he planned to take on, and the dates he'd commit to. He set it in front of me. He said, I don't want this to be only words. It was imperfect. It was real. I cried then, quietly, because the gesture was honest and small and built of the right materials. After we cleared the cups and folded the paper carefully, we sat in the living room a while, the house making the low sounds of ordinary life. The kettle cooled, the radio played something soft. For a long moment, no one spoke. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst had been the slow decline of being seen. The better part was that we had found a way to begin anew through work, small promises, and a little patience. For a long moment, no one spoke. We put dates on the calendar and I felt steadier. The repair fund became real when my son made the first deposit. He texted a photo of the confirmation. It was a small thing, but it felt like promise in pixels. We listed the contractor, set the first date for the gutter and a patch on the roof, and agreed who would be home to let the workers in. The calendar on the fridge began to look like architecture lines that held the day. The weekly calls arrived, 10 minutes on Sunday for a check-in. Some weeks they were long and honest. Some weeks they were short and practical. They became a lifeline. I learned little things, how their week had gone, who needed groceries, if anyone had a cold. Those calls are not grand gestures. They are the mortar between bricks. The daughter-in-law started asking before moving the quilt or shifting the chair. The word please returned to more corners of the house. She said, I'm sorry, with a sincerity that made breathing easy in the room. Phrases like that matter. They start to patch places you didn't know were torn. There was a box moved without notice one rainy afternoon. I felt my old chest tighten. We sat at the table and revisited the agreement. My son apologized and we adjusted the calendar. Once a payment was missed, we called the utility company and sorted it out together. Each time something broke, we treated it like the practical problem it was, not a moral failing. That helped. I reclaimed small things. I began to handle my bills again. I made appointments and kept them. I walked to the post office, key heavy in my hand like a small talisman. Mrs. Dalton noticed and said, You look lighter. I smiled. The key felt like a quiet return. Rituals returned in small ways. Sunday dinners are back, though sometimes we start conversations with lists. We still laugh, and sometimes we cry. The grandchildren come and run in circles. We fold paper boats on rainy afternoons and tape them when they leak. The house is not the same as before. How could it be? Time moves forward, but it is a home again, with new rules and old comforts. Trust is a slow stitch. Signing a paper is like tying the first knot. You still have to weave thread through the remainder. We kept the mediator's number in our phones. She calls sometimes, gently, to check on tone and promises. Having an outside voice stopped old patterns from sliding back in. Neighbors noticed the change. Mrs. Dalton brought over stew and left a note that said simply, Good work. Small validations like that feel like bread when you are hungry. Online, someone in a neighborhood group posted about setting boundaries with kindness. referencing the steps we'd taken. I didn't expect that. The ripple of one family's attempt at justice reached other porches. There are days I wake with a small worry. There are nights that the kettle hums with a memory, and I press my palm to the dent in the table. But now when I worry, I have recourse. I can point to the calendar. I can say, we agreed. That is the language of repair. Practical life resumed in the gentle way of seasons. Roof once patched, porch light still humming, mail arriving more often. The agreements held often enough to rebuild a foundation. It was not perfect. It was human, and slowly, that was enough. But rebuilding trust is slower than signing papers. Dignity is a quiet insistence, not a shout. That's what I learned in the months after the kitchen table. People think dignity is dramatic. It is not. It is a steady set of small choices that say, I matter. 2. If you take one practical thing from my story, make it this. Ask for dates. Don't let later float like steam. Ask when, exactly. Put it on paper. A calendar is not unkind. It is honest. Timelines make caring clearer. Bring a witness to heavy talks. A neighbor, a trusted friend, a mediator from church, someone who will listen and hold the words. When we had a third person at the table, it kept conversations calm. It also made promises more visible. A witness is a small accountability. Write things down. A note on the fridge, a shared calendar, emails that confirm what people mean. Paper doesn't feel romantic. It feels practical. When feelings get loud, the paper keeps the promise silent and steady. Ask for receipts when money changes hands. Ask for a reassessment date. These are not hostile acts. They are scaffolding for love. Keep your rituals. The kettle, the key in the little dish, the photograph on the mantle. These tether you to what you are. They are small resistances to being erased. Teach your children with those rituals. Teach them to say honestly when they can't bear more, and to ask plainly when they need help. Be generous, but set terms. Generosity without terms invites you to disappear. I offered help with limits. Help with limits is kindness that sustains both parties. It is also a valuable model for grandchildren. You can be loving, and you can keep your own life intact. Finally, practice gentle firmness. You do not have to shout to be heard. You can make a schedule, ask that the mail be forwarded, request a written plan, and say no when asked to give in ways that take your home or yourself. Saying no can be an act of love for your family and for yourself. It teaches others how to treat you. We lived out an American ethic in that kitchen. Fairness, civility, and mutual responsibility. I believe in a politics of household care as much as any law. When families learn a vocabulary of respect, it changes who bears burdens and who volunteers to carry them. We weren't perfect, but we were trying. That is the real courage, to try, again and again, in small acts, to build scaffolding where love could be safe, to let your life have a voice and still be kind. If you are in a similar place, take a breath and take a paper. Ask for a time. Bring a friend. Keep your ritual. Hold your key. The world will not fall apart if you ask to be seen. It might finally begin to hold you. We weren't perfect, but we were trying. Neighbors said aloud what they'd kept inside for years. When I told the story at church, women came up and held my hands. They said things like, I stayed too long, and I wish I had asked for paper. Small confessions like those feel like company. An online post from a local group shared our steps. Write it down. Set a calendar. Bring a mediator. People responded. One woman wrote, I finally told my son I needed a plan to. He listened. Another left a comment. Thank you. You gave me permission to ask for time. Mrs. Dalton left a note and a small jar of jam for steady mornings. A neighbor I hardly knew offered to pick up my mail when I was away. These small acts were salt to a wound. They kept the raw edges from getting infected by neglect. And then an email came from a stranger. She wrote she'd been about to sign a legal paper that would have sold her mother's house. And after reading about our calendar and our reassessment, she paused and asked for a 30-day review. She said, You gave me permission to slow down. The note made me cry. It felt like more than my family's patchwork. It felt like a stitch in a larger cloth. A message arrived that made me cry. We still fold paper boats on rainy afternoons. The children crowd the kitchen table and we make small islands to float in the sink. Sometimes we patch the boats with tape when they leak. It's a small lesson about repair. You don't throw out everything that gets a hole. You mend what you can, The fridge calendar hangs with our initials. The repair fund has helped patch the gutters and the porch. My son comes by more often not because he must but because he chooses to. He sits in my chair sometimes, and we talk about small things. The price of tomatoes, the neighbor's cat, the garden. These are ordinary things, but they stitch a life back together. I keep my key on the little dish. It feels familiar in my palm. The kettle still sings at 7. The porch light hums like an old tune, same frequency, softer now. When I walk the garden, I feel steady. Life is marked by both the loss and the tenderness of being known. There are days we stumble. There are days a box moves without asking. But then we sit and call the mediator or pull the calendar closer and say what we need. The house is imperfect and alive. It holds memory and a new kind of care. The porch light hummed the same tune. If this moved you, tell me how you'd have handled it in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories from my kitchen and my porch. Share this with someone who needs permission to ask for clarity. Your words help others find courage. Next time, I'll tell you about a letter I found in the attic, an old note that changed how we remembered a whole summer. Bring your tea. We'll talk then. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to neighbors, mediators, and gentle hands that helped us begin again. See you soon.